behalf of our group, I would like to welcome all of you and to thank Shaban Egan, who is the Community Engagement Librarian here, and the Friends of the Barrington Public Library for co-sponsoring tonight's program with us. Just a little bit about, all the things, all the bells and whistles and things that make noises. Have you silenced them? Okay, before I forget, please do that. So a little bit about East Bay Citizens for Peace. We're a local grassroots group that got started 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, before the United States invaded Iraq. That was the impetus to get us going. And since then, we have continued to hold vigils every second Saturday of the month in downtown Bristol. We put on programs such as tonight's program. We also collaborate with other peace and justice groups in the Rhode Island area. We lobby our congressional delegates. We are a group that is particularly devoted to the pursuit of peaceful solutions to conflict and to both social and economic justice. And we pursue these through open and respectful dialogue, and we expect that that's what's going to go on tonight. So just if you'd like to know more about us, you see there's a table outside. We encourage you to stop by, sign up if you'd like to be on our email list, take any literature, and get involved with a peace-minded group. We will be offering discussion group. I'm sure a lot of discussion will be sparked by Chaz Freeman tonight, and if you'd like to continue the discussion with us, you can sign up to be on that. So, just thinking about how to introduce tonight. I suspect, like many of you, a little over 20 months ago, when Russia invaded Iraq, and actually before, as we were leading up to that, I found myself feeling overwhelmed, horrified, in grief, and feeling incredibly helpless. And as the war has gone on and on, I have really questioned, how can I get clarity on this? I was reading everything I could get my hands on, and then I thought, I know someone whom I respect who has an incredible amount of experience and knowledge about U.S. foreign relations. Someone who has authored 5 books and multiple articles, and also who has been the editor for the editor on diplomacy for the Encyclopedia Britannica. Someone who has a long list of accomplishments, including being the former assistant to the Secretary of Defense and former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And so we are so honored that Ambassador Chaz Freeman has generously offered to speak for us tonight, share his knowledge and his perspective on an incredibly difficult topic, one that many of us have had heated arguments about. And please help me welcome Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Thank you.
Many years ago, when Linus Pauling, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, one for chemistry, one for physics, I believe, was asked what the secret of longevity was, he said, contrary to what everybody expected, something about vitamin C, he said, never let go of the handrail. If he were here tonight, he would join me in getting on this stool, no doubt. I'd like to thank Nancy Hood, East Bay Citizens for Peace, and the Barrington Library for this opportunity to discuss Ukraine. That's what I want to speak to you about tonight. And pardon me if I change my glasses because I do have a text. I want to talk about what's happened to Ukraine and why, how it's likely to emerge from the ordeal to which great power rivalry has subjected it, and can learn from this. I do so with some trepidation and a warning to this audience. My talk, like the conflict in Ukraine itself, is long and complicated. It contradicts propaganda that has been very convincing. My talk will offend anyone who is committed to the official narrative. The way the American media have dealt with the Ukraine war brings to mind a remark by Mark Twain. He said, "The researchers of many commentators have already thrown much darkness on this subject, and it is probable that if they continue, we shall soon know nothing at all about it." It's said that in war, truth is the first casualty. War is typically accompanied by a fog of official lies. No such fog has ever been as thick as in the Ukraine war. While many hundreds of thousands of people have fought and died in Ukraine, the propaganda machines in Brussels, Kyiv, London, Moscow, and Washington have worked overtime to ensure that we take passionate sides, believe what we want to believe, and condemn anyone who questions the narratives that we have internalized. No one out on the front lines has any real idea of what has been happening in this war. What we know is only what our governments and other supporters of the war want us to know. And they have developed the bad habit of inhaling their own propaganda, which guarantees delusional policies. Every government that is a party to the Ukraine war, Kyiv, Moscow, Washington, other NATO capitals, has been guilty of various degrees of self-deception and blundering misfeasance. The consequences for all have been dire. For Ukraine, they have been catastrophic. A radical rethinking of policy by all concerned is, in my view, long overdue. Now, first, some necessary background. I've put this slide up here. It shows the current state of NATO, which expanded steadily to the Russian border. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, came into being to defend the European countries in the post-World War II American sphere of influence against the USSR, the Soviet Union, and its satellite nations. NATO's area of responsibility was the territory of its members in North America and Western Europe, but nowhere beyond that. The alliance helped maintain a balance of power and keep the peace in Europe during the 4+ decades of the Cold War. In 1991, however, the USSR dissolved and the Cold War ended. That eliminated any credible threat to NATO members' territory and raised this question. If NATO was still the answer to something, what was the question? The U.S. Armed Forces had no problem at all responding to this conundrum. They had compelling vested interests in the preservation of NATO. NATO had created and sustained a post-war European role and presence for the U.S. military. This justified a much larger U.S. force structure and many more highly desirable billets for flag officers, generals, and admirals than would otherwise have existed. NATO enhanced the international status of the American Armed Forces while fostering a unique American competence in multinational alliance and coalition management. We're really the only army that knows how to do that. And NATO offered tours of duty in Europe that made peacetime military service more attractive to U.S. soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Then, too, the 20th century had appeared to underscore that U.S. security was inseparable from that of other North Atlantic countries. The existence of European empires ensured that wars among the great powers of Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, soon morphed into world wars. NATO was how the United States dominated and managed the Euro-Atlantic region in the Cold War. Disbanding NATO, or US withdrawal from it, would arguably just free Europeans to renew their quarreling and start yet another war that might not be confined to Europe. So NATO had to be kept in business. The obvious way to accomplish this was to find a new non-European role for the organization. And NATO, it came to be said, had to, quote, go out of area or go out of business, unquote. In other words, the alliance had to be repurposed to project military power beyond the territories of its Western European and North American member states. In 1998, NATO went to war with Serbia, bombing it in 1999 to detach Kosovo from it. In 2001, in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, it joined the US in occupying and attempting to pacify Afghanistan. In 2011, NATO fielded forces to engineer regime change in Libya. In 2014, after a well-prepared US-sponsored anti-Russian coup d'etat in Kyiv, Ukrainian ultranationalists banned the official use of Russian and other minority languages in their country, and at the same time affirmed Ukraine's intention to become part of NATO. Among other consequences, Ukrainian membership in NATO would place Russia's 250-year-old naval base at Sevastopol in the Crimea under US and NATO control. Crimea was Russian-speaking and had several times already voted not to be part of Ukraine. So, citing the precedent of NATO's violent intervention to separate Kosovo from Serbia, Russia organized a referendum in Crimea that endorsed Crimea's reincorporation into the Russian Federation. The results of that referendum, however questionable the organization of it was, were entirely consistent with previous votes on the issue. Meanwhile, in response to Ukraine's banning of the use of Russian in government offices and education, predominantly Russian-speaking areas in the country's Donbas region, you can see here results of various elections and protests, perhaps worth looking at as I speak. Predominantly Russian-speaking areas in the country's Donbas region attempted to secede. Kyiv sent forces to suppress the rebellion. Moscow responded by backing Ukrainian Russian speakers' demands for the minority rights guaranteed to them by the previous Ukrainian constitution, as well as by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. NATO backed Kyiv against Moscow. An escalating civil war among Ukrainians ensued. This soon evolved into an intensifying proxy war in Ukraine between the United States, NATO members, and Russia. Negotiations at Minsk, the capital of Belarus, mediated by the OSCE with French and German support, brokered an agreement between Kyiv and Moscow on a package of measures, including a ceasefire in the Donbas, the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, the release of prisoners of war, constitutional reform in Ukraine, granting self-government to certain areas of Donbas, and the restoration of Kyiv's control of the rebel area's borders with Russia. The United Nations Security Council endorsed these terms. They represented Moscow's acceptance that Russian-speaking provinces in Ukraine would remain part of a united but federalized Ukraine, provided they enjoyed Quebec-style linguistic autonomy. But with US support, Ukraine refused to carry out what it had agreed to. Years later, the French and German governments admitted that their mediation efforts at Minsk had been a ruse directed at gaining time to arm Kiev against Moscow. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, like his predecessor in office, Petro Poroshenko, confessed that he had never planned to implement the accords, although he ran on a platform in the elections that he won, ran on a platform of implementing those accords. So Ukrainian politicians are no more admirable in some ways than American politicians, I suppose. In 1990, in the context of German reunification, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and Russia's abandonment of its political economic sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe, the West had several times slyly but solemnly promised not to fill the resulting strategic vacuum by expanding NATO into it. But as the 1990s proceeded, despite a lack of enthusiasm on the part of some other NATO members, the United States insisted on doing just that. NATO enlargement steadily erased the East European cordon sanitaire that successive Russian governments had considered essential to their security. As former members of the Warsaw Pact entered NATO, U.S. weaponry, troops, and bases appeared on their territory. In 2008, after a final move, pardon me, I'm having trouble with the text. In 2008, after a final move to extend the U.S. sphere of influence to Russia's borders, Washington persuaded NATO to declare its intention to admit both Ukraine and Georgia as members. The equivalent for the United States would be Mexico and Canada entering the Warsaw Pact. The eastward deployment of U.S. forces placed ballistic missile defense launchers in both Romania and Poland. These were technically capable of rapid reconfiguration to mount short-range strikes on Moscow. Their deployment fueled Russian fears of a decapitating U.S. surprise attack. If Ukraine entered NATO and the U.S. made comparable deployments there, Russia would have only about 5 minutes warning of a strike on Moscow, less if they were hypersonic missiles. NATO's role in detaching Kosovo from Serbia and in U.S. regime change operations and pacification operations in Afghanistan and Libya, as well as in support of anti-Russian forces in Ukraine, convinced Moscow that it could no longer dismiss NATO as a purely defensive alliance. As early as 1994, successive Russian governments began to warn the United States, Boris Yeltsin, and NATO, that continued Russian expansion, especially to Ukraine and Georgia, would compel a forceful response. Washington was aware of Russian determination to do this from multiple sources, including reports from its ambassadors in Moscow. In February 2007, Vladimir Putin, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, declared, quote, "I think it's obvious that NATO expansion represents a serious provocation, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact?" On February 1st, 2008, Ambassador Bill Burns, now the head of the CIA, warned in a telegram from Moscow that on this subject, Russians were united and determined and serious. Burns felt so strongly about the consequences of NATO expansion into Ukraine that he gave his cable the subject line, "Niet means niet. No means no." In March 2008, NATO nonetheless invited both Ukraine and Georgia to join it. Moscow protested that, quote, membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake, which could have most serious consequences for pan-European security, unquote. By August 2008, as if to underscore this point, when an emboldened Georgia sought to extend its rule to rebellious minority areas on the Russian border, Moscow went to war to consolidate their independence. This is Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Less than a day after the US-sponsored coup that installed an anti-Russian government in Kyiv in 2014, Washington formally recognized the new regime. When Russia then annexed Crimea and civil war broke out with Ukraine's Russian speakers, as I mentioned earlier, the United States sided with and aided and armed the Ukrainian ultranationalists whose policies had alienated Crimea and provoked the Russian-speaking secessionists. The United States and NATO began a multi-billion-dollar effort to reorganize, retrain, and re-equip Kyiv's armed forces. The avowed purpose was to allow Kyiv to reconquer the Donbass and eventually Crimea. Ukraine's regular army was then decrepit. Kyiv's initial attacks on Russian speakers in the Ukrainian eastern and southern regions were largely conducted by ultranationalist militias. By 2015, Russian soldiers were fighting alongside the Donbass rebels. An undeclared US-NATO proxy war with Russia had begun. Over the course of the next 8 years, during which the Ukraine civil war continued, Kyiv built a NATO-trained army of 700,000 men, not counting 1 million reserves, and hardened it in battle with Russian-supported separatists. Ukrainian regulars numbered only slightly less than Russia's then 830,000 active duty military personnel. In 8 years, Ukraine had acquired a larger force than any NATO member other than the United States or Turkey, outnumbering the armed forces of Britain, France, and Germany combined. Not surprisingly, Russia saw this as a threat. Meanwhile, as tensions with Russia escalated, in early 2019, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty, which had banned ground-launched missiles with ranges of up to 3,420 miles from deployment in Europe. Russia condemned this as a destructive act that would stoke security risks. Despite ongoing misgivings on the part of some other NATO members, at American insistence, NATO continued periodically to reiterate its offer to incorporate Ukraine into its ranks as a member, doing so once more on September 1st, 2021, just a few months before the war began. By that time, after billions of dollars of US training and arms transfers, Kyiv judged it was finally ready to crush its Russian speakers' rebellion and their Russian allies. As 2021 ended, Ukraine stepped up its pressure on the Donbass separatists and deployed forces to mount a major offensive against them beginning in early 2022. At about the same time, in December 2021, 28 years after Moscow's first warning to Washington, Vladimir Putin issued a formal demand for written security guarantees to reduce the apparent threats to Russia from NATO enlargement by restoring Ukraine's neutrality, banning the stationing of US forces on Russian borders, and reinstating limits on the deployment of intermediate range and shorter range missiles in Europe. The Russian Foreign Ministry then presented a draft treaty to Washington incorporating these terms, which echoed similar demands put forward by former President Boris Yeltsin in 1997. At the same time, apparently both to underscore Moscow's seriousness and to counter Kyiv's planned offensive against the Donbass secessionists, Russia massed troops along its border with Ukraine. On February 26, 2022, the U.S. formally responded to the Russians that neither it nor NATO would agree to negotiate Ukrainian neutrality or other such issues with Russia. A few days later, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov laid out his understanding of the American and NATO positions at a meeting of Russia's Security Council as follows, quote, "Our Western colleagues are not prepared to take up our major proposals, primarily those on NATO's eastward non-expansion. This demand was rejected with reference to the bloc's so-called open door policy and the freedom of each state to choose its own way of ensuring security. Neither the United States nor NATO proposed an alternative to this key provision. Moscow wanted negotiations, but in their absence, it was prepared to go to war to remove the threats to which it objected. Washington knew this when it rejected talks with Moscow. The American refusal to talk was an unambiguous decision to accept the risk of war rather than explore any compromise or accommodation with Russia. U.S. and allied intelligence services immediately began releasing information purporting to describe impending Russian military operations and what they described as an effort to deter those operations. Incidentally, if you go back and read the predictions, they don't match at all what the Russians did, which is sort of interesting. In mid-February, fighting between Ukrainian army and secessionist forces in Donbass intensified, with OSCE observers reporting a rapid rise in ceasefire violations by both sides, but with most allegedly initiated by Ukraine. Perhaps disingenuously, the Donbass secessionists then appealed to Moscow to protect them and ordered a general evacuation of civilians into safe havens in Russia. On February 21, Russian President Putin recognized the independence of the two Donbass so-called People's Republics and ordered Russian forces to secure them against Ukrainian attacks. On February 24, 2022, in an address to the Russian nation, Putin then declared that, quote, "Russia cannot feel safe, develop, and exist with a constant threat emanating from the territory of modern Ukraine," unquote. And he announced that he had ordered what he called a special military operation, quote, "to protect people who have been subjected to bullying and genocide for the last 8 years," unquote, and to strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. He added that, quote, "It is a fact that over the past 30 years, we have been patiently trying to come to an agreement with the leading NATO countries regarding the principles of equal and indivisible security in Europe. In response to our proposals, we invariably faced either cynical deception and lies or attempts at pressure and blackmail, while the North Atlantic Alliance continued to expand despite our protests and concerns. Its military machine is moving, and as I said, is approaching our very border." The official narrative put forward by the US and NATO, information warfare against Russia, contradicts every element of this statement by President Putin. Unfortunately, however, the record affirms it. In the post-Soviet era, NATO, the US sphere of influence in Europe, and our military presence there, constantly expanded toward Russia's borders, despite escalating Russian warnings and protests. By contrast, Moscow was in constant retreat. It had abandoned its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It made no effort to reestablish it. Moscow repeatedly warned that NATO enlargement and US forward deployment of forces that might threaten it, especially from Ukraine, were a grave threat to it to which he would feel compelled to react. given NATO's transformation from a purely defensive Europe-focused alliance into an instrument for power projection in support of U.S. regime change and other military operations beyond its members' borders, Moscow had a reasonable basis for concern that Ukrainian membership in NATO would pose an active threat to its security. This threat was underscored by U.S. withdrawal from the treaty that had prevented us from stationing intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe, including in Ukraine. Moscow consistently demanded neutrality for Ukraine. Neutrality would make Ukraine both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe, rather than part of Russia or a platform for Russian power projection against the rest of Europe. By contrast, the United States sought to make Ukraine a member of NATO, part of our sphere of influence, and a platform for the deployment of U.S. military power against Russia. Moscow agreed at Minsk to respect continued Ukrainian sovereignty in the Donbas region, provided the rights of Russian speakers there were guaranteed. But with support from the US and NATO, Ukraine declined to implement the Minsk Accords and redoubled its efforts to subjugate the Donbas. When Washington refused to hear the Russian case for mutual accommodations in Europe and instead insisted on Ukrainian membership in NATO, our government knew that this would produce a Russian military response. In fact, Washington publicly predicted this. Early in the resulting war, when third-party mediation achieved a draft peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine, the West, represented by the British, intervened to insist that Ukraine repudiate it. And this sad incident brings me to the war aims of the participants in the war, which each side has chosen to mischaracterize in the case of the others. Kyiv has not wavered from its objectives, which are forging a purely Ukrainian national identity from which Russian and other languages, cultures, and religious authorities are excluded. Just today, Orbán, the right-wing president of Hungary, announced that he would oppose any further assistance to Ukraine until the 150,000 Hungarian-speaking residents of Ukraine are allowed to use their own language as they were under the old constitution. Ukraine wanted to subjugate the Russian speakers who rebelled in response to this attempt at their forced assimilation. Ukraine wanted to obtain US and NATO protection and integrate into the EU. Ukraine wanted to reconquer the Russian-speaking territories Moscow had illegally annexed and from Ukraine, including the Donbas oblasts and Crimea. I should go back to some of the consequences of 2014, and you can see this is where things stood pretty much on the verge of the conflict, and here is the conflict as it began. Moscow clearly stated its maximum and minimum objectives in the draft treaty that it presented to Washington on December 12, 2021. Core interests of Russia have been and remain, first, to deny Ukraine to the American sphere of influence that has engulfed the rest of Eastern Europe by compelling Ukraine to affirm neutrality between the United States, NATO, and Russia. And second, to protect and ensure the basic rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Washington's objectives, which NATO has dutifully adopted as its own, have been much more open-ended and unspecific. As National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan put it in June 2022, a few months after the war began, quote, "We have refrained from laying out what we see as an endgame. We have been focused on what we can do today, tomorrow, next week, to strengthen the Ukrainians' hands to the maximum extent possible, first on the battlefield and then ultimately at the negotiating table. Inasmuch as the first principle of warfare is to establish realistic objectives, a strategy to obtain them, and a plan for war termination, what Sullivan said is a perfect description of how to brew up a forever war. As Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and Yemen attest, this has become the established American way of war. No clear objectives, no plan to achieve them, and no concept of how to end a war, on what terms, and with whom. The most cogent statement, uncharacteristically, I'm sorry to say, of U.S. objectives in this war was offered by President Biden as it began. He said his goal with Russia was, quote, to sap its economic strength and weaken its military for years to come, unquote, whatever it takes. At no point has the United States government or NATO declared that the protection of Ukraine or Ukrainians, as opposed to exploiting their bravery to take down Russia, is the Central American objective. We've been prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian. In April 2022, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin reiterated that U.S. aid to Ukraine was intended to, quote, weaken and isolate Russia, unquote, and thereby deprive it of any credible capacity to make war in future. Quite a few American politicians and pundits have extolled the benefits to having Ukrainians rather than Americans sacrifice their lives for this purpose. Some have gone farther and advocated the breakup of the Russian Federation as a war aim. If you're Russian, you don't have to be paranoid to see such threats as existential. Russian President Putin assesses U.S. war aims as directed at humbling the Russian Federation strategically and, if possible, overthrowing its government and dismembering it. The United States has not disputed his assessment. In mid-March 2022, the government of Turkey and Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett mediated between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators who tentatively agreed on the outlines of a negotiated interim settlement. The agreement provided that Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23rd, when it controlled part of the Donbas region and all of the Crimea, and in exchange, Ukraine was promised not to seek NATO membership and would instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. A meeting between Russian President Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky was in the process of being arranged. To finalize this agreement, which the negotiators had initialed ad referendum, meaning subject to approval by higher authority. On March 28, 2022, President Zelensky publicly affirmed that Ukraine was ready for neutrality, combined with security guarantees as part of a peace agreement with Russia. But on April 9, then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a surprise visit to Kyiv. During his visit, he reportedly urged Zelensky not to meet Putin because, first, Putin was a war criminal and weaker than he seemed. He should and could be crushed rather than accommodated. And second, even if Ukraine was ready to end the war, NATO was not. Zelensky's proposed meeting with Putin was then called off. Putin declared that talks with Ukraine had come to a dead end. Zelensky explained that, quote, Moscow would like to have one treaty that would resolve all the issues. However, not everyone sees themselves at the table with Russia. For them, security guarantees for Ukraine is one issue, and the agreement with the Russian Federation is another issue. This marked the end of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, and thus of any prospect for the resolution of the conflict anywhere but on the battlefield. This war was born and has been continued due to miscalculations by all sides. NATO expansion was legal, but predictably provocative. Russia's response was entirely predictable, if illegal, and has proven very costly to it. Ukraine's de facto military integration has resulted in its devastation. The United States calculated that Russian threats to go to war over Ukrainian neutrality were bluffs that might be deterred by outlining and denigrating Russian plans and intentions as Washington understood them. Russia assumed that the United States would prefer negotiations to war and would wish to avoid the redivision of Europe into hostile blocs. Ukrainians counted on the West protecting their country. When Russian performance in the first months of the war proved lackluster, the West concluded that Ukraine could defeat it. None of these calculations have proved correct. Nevertheless, official propaganda, amplified by subservient mainstream and social media, has convinced most in the West that rejecting negotiations on NATO expansion and encouraging Ukraine to fight Russia is somehow pro-Ukrainian. Sympathy for the Ukrainian war effort is entirely understandable, and I share it. But as the Vietnam War should have taught us, democracies lose when cheerleading replaces objectivity in reporting, and governments prefer their own propaganda to the truth of what is happening on the battleground. The only way you can judge the success or failure of policies is by reference to the objectives they were designed to achieve. So how are the participants in the Ukraine war doing in terms of achieving their objectives? Let's start with Ukraine. From 2014 to 2022, the civil war in Ukraine took nearly 15,000 lives. How many have been killed in action since the US-Russian proxy war began in February 22 is unknown. It's a felony in Ukraine to reveal casualty figures. But it's certainly in the several hundreds of thousands. Casualty numbers have been concealed by unprecedentedly intense information warfare. The only information in the West about the dead and wounded has been propaganda from Kyiv, claiming vast numbers of Russian dead while revealing nothing at all about their own casualties. It's known, however, that 10% of Ukrainians are now involved with the armed forces, and 78% have relatives or friends who have been killed or wounded. An estimated 50,000 Ukrainians are now amputees. To put this in perspective, during World War I, where amputation was the standard treatment for a wound to a limb, only 41,000 Britons had to have amputations. Fewer than 2,000 US veterans of the Afghan and Iraq invasions had amputations. Most observers believe that Ukrainian forces have taken much heavier losses than their Russian enemies, and that hundreds of thousands of them have given their lives in their country's defense and in their efforts to retake territory occupied by the Russians. When the war began, Ukraine had a population of about 31 million. The country has since lost at least 1/3 of its people. Over 6 million have taken refuge in the West. 2 million or more have left for Russia. Russian-speaking Ukrainians have left. Another 8 million Ukrainians have been driven from their homes, but remain in Ukraine. Ukraine's infrastructure, industries, and cities have been devastated and its economy destroyed. As is usual in war, corruption, long a prominent feature of Ukrainian politics, has been rampant. Ukraine's nascent democracy is no more, with all opposition parties, uncontrolled media outlets, and dissent outlawed. On the other hand, Russian aggression has united Ukrainians, including many who are Russian-speaking, to an extent never seen before. Moscow has thereby inadvertently reinforced the separate Ukrainian identity that both Russian mythology and President Vladimir Putin have sought to deny. What Ukraine has lost in territory, it has gained in patriotic cohesion based on passionate opposition to Moscow. The flip side of this, of course, is that Ukraine's Russian-speaking separatists have also had their Russian identity reinforced. There's now little to no possibility of their accepting the status in a united Ukraine, as would have been the case under the Minsk Accords. And with the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive, it's very, I want to show you where you can see what Ukraine has gained on this slide. It is a tiny little blue area or two. And anyway, with the failure of the counteroffensive, which is now very clear, it's unlikely that Donbass or Crimea will ever return to Ukrainian sovereignty. As the war continues, Ukraine may well lose more territory, including its access to the Black Sea. What's been lost on the battlefield and in the hearts of the people cannot be regained at the negotiating table. Ukraine will emerge from this war maimed, crippled, and much reduced in both territory and population. Finally, there is now no realistic prospect of Ukrainian membership in NATO. As NSC advisor Sullivan has said, quote, everyone needs to look squarely at the fact that allowing Ukraine to join NATO at this point means war with Russia. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has stated that the prerequisite for Ukrainian membership in NATO is a peace treaty between it and Russia. No such treaty is anywhere in sight. In continuing to insist that Ukraine will become a NATO member once the war is concluded, the West has perversely incentivized Russia not to agree to end the war. But in the end, Ukraine will have to make peace with Russia, almost certainly largely on Russian terms. Whatever else the war may be achieving, it has not been good for Ukraine. Ukraine's bargaining position vis-à-vis Russia has been greatly weakened. But then Kyiv's fate has always been an afterthought in U.S. policy circles. Washington has instead sought to exploit Ukrainian courage to thrash Russia, reinvigorate NATO, and reinforce U.S. primacy in Europe. And it has not spent any time at all thinking about how to restore peace to Europe. How about Russia? Has it succeeded in expelling American influence from Ukraine? Has it forced Kyiv to declare neutrality or reinstated the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine? Clearly not. For now, at least, Ukraine has become a complete dependency of the United States and its NATO allies. Kyiv is an embittered, long-term antagonist of Moscow. Kyiv clings to its ambitions to join NATO. Russians in Ukraine are the targets of the local version of cancel culture. Whatever the outcome of the war, mutual animosity has erased the Russian myth of Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood based on a common origin in Kievan Rus. Russia has had to abandon 3 centuries of efforts to identify with Europe and instead pivot to China, India, the Islamic world, and Africa. Reconciliation with a seriously alienated European Union will not come easily, if at all. Russia may not have lost on the battlefield or been weakened or strategically isolated, but it has incurred huge opportunity costs. Then, too, NATO has expanded to include Finland and potentially Sweden. This does not change the military balance in Europe, by the way. Western portrayal of Russia as inherently predatory notwithstanding, Moscow has had neither the desire nor the capability to attack either of these 2 friendly, formally very Western-aligned and formidably armed, but nominally neutral states. Nor does either Finland or Sweden have any intention of joining an unprovoked attack on Russia. But their decision to join NATO is politically wounding for Moscow. Since the West shows no willingness to accommodate Russian security concerns, if Moscow is to achieve its goals, it now has no apparent alternative to battling on. And as it does so, it is stimulating European determination to meet previously ignored NATO targets for defense spending and to acquire self-reliant military capabilities directed at countering Russia independently of those of the United States. Poland is reemerging as a powerful hostile force on Russia's borders. These trends are changing the European military balance to Moscow's long-term disadvantage. What about the United States? In 2022 alone, the United States approved $113 billion in aid to Ukraine. The Russian defense budget in that year was less than half of that, $54 billion. It has since roughly doubled. Russian defense industries have been revitalized. Some now produce more weaponry in a month than they previously did in a year. Russia's autarkic economy has weathered 18 months of all-out war against it from both the US and the EU. It just overtook Germany to become the fifth wealthiest economy in the world and the largest in Europe, if measured in terms of purchasing power parity, which is the best way of comparing the size of economies. Despite repeated Western claims that Russia was running out of ammunition or losing the war of attrition in Ukraine, it has not, while the West has. Ukrainian bravery, which has been hugely impressive, has been no match for Russian firepower. Meanwhile, the alleged threat from Russia to the West, once a powerful argument for NATO unity, has lost credibility. Russia's armed forces have proven unable to conquer Ukraine, let alone the rest of Europe. But the war has taught Russia how to counter and overcome most of the most advanced weaponry in the NATO and US inventory. Before the United States and NATO rejected negotiations, Russia was prepared to accept a neutral and federalized Ukraine. In the opening phase of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia reaffirmed this willingness in a draft peace treaty with Ukraine, which the United States and NATO blocked Kyiv from signing. Western diplomatic intransigence has failed to persuade Moscow. Western diplomatic intransigence has failed to persuade Moscow to accommodate either Ukrainian nationalism or Ukraine's inclusion in NATO and the American sphere of influence in Europe. The proxy war seems instead to have convinced Moscow that it must gut Ukraine, keep the Ukrainian territories it has illegally annexed, and likely add more, thus ensuring that Ukraine is a dysfunctional state, unable either to join NATO or to fulfill the ultra-nationalist anti-Russian vision of its World War II neo-Nazi hero, Stepan Bandera. The war has led to the superficial unity of NATO, but there are obvious fissures among members. The sanctions imposed on Russia have done heavy damage to European economies. Without Russian energy supplies, some European industries are no longer internationally competitive. The effects on Germany have been particularly profound. As NATO's recent summit at Vilnius showed, member countries differ on the desirability of admitting Ukraine. The NATO unity seems unlikely to outlast the war. These realities explain why most of America's European partners want to end the war as soon as possible. The Ukraine war has clearly put paid to the post-Soviet era in Europe, but it has not made Europe in any respect more secure. It has not enhanced America's international reputation or consolidated US primacy. The war has instead accelerated the emergence of a post-American multipolar world order. One feature of this is an anti-American axis between Russia and China. To weaken Russia, the United States has resorted to unprecedentedly intrusive unilateral sanctions including secondary sanctions targeting normal arm's-length commercial activity between other countries that doesn't involve a U.S. nexus and is legal in the jurisdiction of the transacting parties. Washington has been actively blocking trade between countries that have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, just because they won't jump on the U.S. policy bandwagon. As a result, much of the world is now engaged in pursuit of financial and supply chain linkages that are independent of U.S. control. This includes intensified international efforts to end dollar hegemony, which is the basis for U.S. primacy. Should these efforts succeed, the United States will no longer be able to run the trade and balance of payments deficits that sustain our current standard of living and status as the most powerful society on the planet. Washington's use of political and economic pressure to compel other countries to conform to our anti-Russian and anti-Chinese policies has clearly backfired. It has encouraged even former U.S. client states to search for ways to avoid entanglement in future American conflicts and proxy wars that they do not support, like that in Ukraine. To this end, they are abandoning exclusive reliance on the United States and forging ties to multiple economic and political military partners. You can see this particularly in the Middle East with Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE all separating themselves from the United States in every respect. They want to hold on to our protection, but in every other respect, they're diversifying their international relations. Far from isolating Russia or China, America's coercive diplomacy has helped both Moscow and Beijing to enhance relationships in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that reduce U.S. influence in favor of their own. In short, U.S. policy has resulted in great suffering in Ukraine and escalating defense budgets here and in Europe, but has failed to weaken or isolate Russia. More of the same will not accomplish either of these oft-stated American objectives. Russia has been educated in how to combat American weapons systems and has developed effective counters to them. It has been militarily strengthened, not weakened. It has been reoriented and freed from Western influence, not isolated. If the purpose of war is to establish a better peace, this war is not doing that. Ukraine is being eviscerated on the altar of Russophobia. At this point, no one can confidently predict how much of Ukraine or how many Ukrainians will be left when the fighting stops, or how to stop it. Kyiv just failed to meet more than a fraction of its recruitment goals. Combating Russia to the last Ukrainian was always an odious strategy. But when NATO is about to run out of Ukrainians, it's not just cynical, it's no longer a viable option. What can we learn from this debacle? It's provided many unwelcome reminders of basic principles of statecraft. Wars don't decide who is right, they decide who is left. The best way to avoid war is to reduce or eliminate the apprehensions and grievances that cause it. When you refuse to hear, let alone address an aggrieved party's case for adjustments in your policies toward it, you risk a violent reaction from it. No one should enter a war without realistic objectives, a strategy to achieve them, and a plan for war termination. Self-righteousness and bravery are no substitutes for military mass firepower and stamina. In the end, wars are won and lost on the battlefield, not with propaganda inspired by and directed at reinforcing wishful thinking. What's been lost on the battlefield can seldom, if ever, be recovered at the negotiating table. When wars cannot be won, it is usually better to seek terms by which to end them than to reinforce failure. It's time to prioritize saving as much as possible of Ukraine. This war has become existential for it. Ukraine needs diplomatic backing to craft a peace with Russia if its military sacrifices are not to have been in vain. It is being destroyed. It must be rebuilt. The key to preserving Ukraine is to empower and back Kyiv to end the war on the best terms it can obtain, to facilitate the return of its refugees, many of whom show no intention of returning, and to use the European Union accession process to advance liberal reforms and institute clean government in a neutral Ukraine. Unfortunately, as things stand, both Moscow and Washington seem determined to persist in Ukraine's ongoing destruction. But whatever the outcome of this war, Kyiv and Moscow will eventually have to find a basis for coexistence. Washington needs to support Kyiv in challenging Russia to recognize both the wisdom and the necessity of respect for Ukrainian neutrality and territorial integrity. Finally, this war should provoke some serious rethinking here in Moscow and by NATO of the consequences of diplomacy-free, militarized foreign policy. Had the United States agreed to talk with Moscow, even if it had continued to reject much of what Moscow demanded, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine as it did. Had the West not intervened to prevent Ukraine from ratifying the treaty others helped it agree with Russia at the outset of the war, Ukraine would now be intact and at peace. This war didn't need to take place. Every party to it has lost far more than it has gained. There's a lot to be learned from what happened in and to Ukraine. I think we should thoroughly study these lessons and take them to heart. Thank you.
Give you a chance to take a breath and drink some water.
Okay.
Wow. So we have time for some questions. What time do we need to be out of here? Shaban? 8:30? Okay. So,
I said it was long and complicated. I'm sorry.
well, it is. Wow. Okay, so we have some time for question and answer, and what I would really like is for people to be short-winded in your questions so that everyone who wants to ask a question has a chance to.
And I will try to be brief in the responses.
All right. So you need my help in corralling people? Let me
Sir.
know.
If you could divide what said, sir, what would you tell that you should try to do in this political?
The opposite of what he did at the UN General Assembly, which was to say that he opposed peace negotiations because they would reward Russia. It's not for the United States to decide the fate of Ukraine. That is being decided on the battlefield. It would be far better for Ukrainians and Russians and Europeans to get together to find a basis for the continued existence of Ukraine and the creation of a prosperous and, one hopes, democratic Ukraine that can serve, as I said, as a bridge and a buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe. Sorry, yes.
Would the creation of a third neutral state out of both Russian and Ukrainian territory be a viable option?
If you didn't hear the question, it was, would the creation of a neutral state basically on Ukrainian territory be a viable option? And the answer is yes. One of the most mysterious things about the appallingly mistakes we made in diplomacy in Ukraine is that there's a model. In 1955, at the height of the Cold War, when the United States, Britain, France, and Russia, Soviet Union, occupied Austria, we created a new country, Austria. It had not existed as a separate independent country. In the treaty that came into being in 1956, the Austrian State Treaty, Austria agreed to treat its minority peoples, Slovenes, Hungarians, Italians in the Tyrol area, with respect, allow them to use their language for official business and for education, and as a sidebar, not in the treaty, agreed to remain neutral. And Austria has prospered in neutrality in the middle of Europe, but did not join either the Russian or American sphere of influence. And that model could have been applied to Ukraine. But the people who wanted a war with Russia got one. Yes.
Wonderful lecture, Ted. Great to have you here in Barrington. Could you comment on the role of two important powers here? China, of course, I think we'd like to hear your thoughts on that, as well as Turkey. And on the latter point, I'm particularly curious about the event of last week where Azerbaijan seems to have acted against Armenia. So maybe you have a thought on that as well. And maybe what role did Turkey and China maybe have in a possible peace negotiation?
How much time do you have? Several quick responses. First, on Turkey. Turkey has, like Russia, abandoned its drive to Europeanize itself. It is now defining itself as a civilization associated with the Islamic world, Middle East, and Central Asia, where the so-called stands are, with one exception, Turkic speaking. So Turkey is a member of NATO, but in many respects, it now behaves as though it were an entente partner of NATO, meaning a limited partner for limited purposes. And this is, of course, very difficult for us. Take a minute to describe why Turkey is important. You can't conduct a policy toward Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Gulf, Afghanistan, Russia, Greece, the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus, Russia, I mentioned Russia, NATO, the European Union, Central Asia, or the Islamic world without either Turkish acquiescence or support. It is pivotal in global geopolitical terms, and we are losing it. So that is one thing. China. China is on the horns of a dilemma. Chinese foreign policy, Chinese ideology emphasizes the basic principles of the UN Charter based on national sovereignty, the Westphalian principle of the equality of states, the territorial integrity of those states, and here Russia, as we did, frankly, in Serbia, has violated all those principles. What do the Chinese do? They pronounce the principles and hold their fire, essentially. They have not joined the Russians in this war. They have not cut off relations with Russia. One of the reasons for that is illustrated by our effort to get NATO to establish an office in Tokyo, thus ensuring that we encircle Russia from both sides, and China, and that NATO is suddenly brought into an anti-China posture. So the Chinese are holding their fire. They have put forward 12 principles for a peace agreement, which are basically unobjectionable. We'll see whether that leads to some mediation of the sort that they conducted between Saudi Arabia and Iran. What was the other question? Okay. Sir.
Do you think like the U.S. foreign policy might change after, like, have we learned a lesson of this incident? Because like Iraq,
President Trump restore rationality to?
Because like looking at the conflict between China, potential conflict between China and Taiwan, it doesn't really come across as different.
That's a whole other subject, although I invite you to go to my website, which I apologize for because I built it myself and therefore it is really crummy. But it's Chas, C-H-A-S, Freeman, all one word, .net. And there you will find extensive discussions of the Taiwan conundrum. Essentially, I'll make a couple of comments in relation to Ukraine about that issue. One is that we're repeating the pattern of no diplomacy and reliance on military measures only. We imagine that we can militarily deter China, and so that's all we're doing. Lyle Goldstein, who's sitting in front of you and is a resident of Barrington and should be brought in to speak on this subject, will tell you that we no longer have the capability necessarily to prevail. This is the result of a civil war among Chinese. For 23 years, we went to the UN every year. I used to do this. I want to boast, I'm a really good diplomat. We went to the UN every year, and we said, there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China. The government of China is in Taipei, not in Beijing. That's a bogus regime. And we were so good that for 23 years we got away with this nonsense until Nixon and later Jimmy Carter acknowledged reality. This is a civil war. When Mr. Lincoln heard about Fort Sumter and his cabinet said, well, if you go to war, you can't guarantee the Brits won't come in because they supported the Confederacy. And it'll do huge damage to the economy. And we don't know, you never know what a war is going to end up like. Did Mr. Lincoln say, okay, I'll just give up? Civil wars are inherently passionate, as the war in Ukraine illustrates. Final point is, unfortunately, the Chinese have learned that we are allergic to being attacked with a nuclear weapon. And we have been very careful to make this a proxy war, not so far to cross in a red line that leads to a Russian use of nuclear weapons against us. And the Chinese have drawn this conclusion, and they are heavying up their nuclear deterrent. So if we get into a fight over Taiwan, the Chinese will have the capacity to destroy us many times over, as we have the capacity to destroy them. Basically, I don't know what your religious background is, but this tells me we're nothing but chimpanzees with bigger brains, and we're not very smart. Okay, someone over here? Yes.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I've been really frustrated with trying to find accurate information about conflict.
Yeah.
And I was curious what you recommend as trusted news sources or journalists on.
I'm sorry to, the question was, the young lady has been frustrated getting information about the war that was reliable. QED, that was what our government, the British government, the Russian government, the Ukrainian government wanted to happen. As I said at the outset, this has been the most intensive information warfare ever seen. There is no trusted source. There are every source, well, we have the First Amendment in the United States, supposedly. But if you say anything on Twitter, I guess it's now known as X, that deviates from the official line, you're gone. Facebook will censor you. The mainstream media are scribes for the government. So the answer is there are a few individuals, one of them sitting right here, and I'll recommend your book, but you have to give me the name of it again. How the West Brought War to Ukraine by Ben Abelow, A-B-E-L-O-W, and I highly recommend it. It's concise and very accurate, sticks to the facts. Most debates or discussions of this engage in a priori reasoning. Putin is the devil. Therefore, everything that has happened must have been a devilish scheme on his part. Therefore, we must combat evil and so on. Not a single fact in there. So I think it's extraordinarily hard to get information. You can't get Russian media here. In Europe, where they don't have the First Amendment, RT is banned. I mean, the censorship is overt. I would say probably the best source of news is from India, which doesn't have a dog in this fight. Has good relations with Russia and good relations with the United States. And there is a channel, an Indian video channel called WION, which provides somewhat inaccurate but more accurate information about the war than I've seen elsewhere. Sir?
Well, thank you, and you've given us for me, a great deal to think about. Could you talk a little bit about what we hear in terms of Russian citizens who oppose this conflict, and whether or not it's accurate or what we hear in terms of the oppression of those people?
I think there certainly are still dissidents in Russia, although it's dangerous to be a dissident anywhere in wartime. You can try it here and see what happens. But in Russia, of course, it's an elected dictatorship, an elected autocracy. This, unfortunately, seems to be where a lot of societies are evolving. Mr. Modi in India, Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, other examples, maybe Mr. Trump here. But I think all of there are reliable polls in Russia, and they show overwhelming support for Mr. Putin, which is what you'd expect in wartime. The leader always has people rallying around him. I think a lot of people, including a lot of Russian intellectuals, some of whom are my friends, are pretty disenchanted with this whole thing, and would agree with my statement that Russia has lost heavily as a result of the decision it made to react in the way it did. You know, everybody says, well, the war caused this, the war caused German economy to collapse, the war caused the end of the grain trade, the war caused this, this and that and the other. That's not the case. The reaction to the war is what caused those things. We didn't have to, the Ukrainians did not have to mine their own harbors so that grain could not be exported from them. It wasn't a Russian blockade initially that stopped the grain trade. It was Ukrainian defensive mining. We didn't have to impose unilateral sanctions. We didn't have to take over SWIFT, the clearinghouse for trade settlement in Brussels, but the dollar, that's the instrument for our dollar hegemony. We did these things, and we've provoked a reaction, and you have basically a protest movement by the global majority, and they just met in South Africa with the BRICS. This is, I don't know whether they will ever amount to anything, but they are a protest movement. They are against American hegemony. What they all want strong bilateral relations with the United States, especially those who have our military protection. But as I said earlier with regard to the Middle East, they don't want the rest of it. They don't want us telling them what they have to do with respect to Ukraine or other issues. And they follow the UN Charter. Under the UN Charter, by the way, most of our sanctions are illegal. They are unilateral. The UN Charter bans that. But you'd never know it in the discussion that we have of, for example, maximum pressure on Iran. By the way, I think maximum pressure on Iran is going to produce the same result that maximum pressure on North Korea did. There was no nuclear threat from North Korea. Maximum pressure produced one. And at some point, the religious scruples of the Ayatollah, who has, the supreme ruler in Iran, has ruled that weapons of mass destruction are unacceptable in Islam, and at some point that religious barrier is likely to give way. So I think we should be, maybe we should try diplomacy for once in a while instead of trying to ostracize people, not talk to them, and so forth. Yes?
You just brought up a topic I wanted you to address. How would we get our country to start using diplomacy?
Well, it's,
To me, if you're totally focused on being a military country, putting all our money in the Pentagon, how would we, as citizens, make a difference?
I wish there were an easy answer for that.
I wish there was.
You know, as the East Bay Citizens for Peace, what a lonely voice those advocating diplomacy represent. It's very easy to go to a Celtics game or a Red Sox game and shout USA, 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 and, support our troops and so forth and so on. Diplomacy is not, it isn't very exciting to look at. It doesn't blow up things very much. Doesn't fit well on the TV screen at night. It's necessarily secretive, Woodrow Wilson notwithstanding. Of course, he, at Versailles, was very secretive and produced a monster, but that's neither here nor there. I have to say that our institutions to conduct diplomacy are almost destroyed. We've had a succession of secretaries of state who did not meet the criteria for the job. There are four. First, you have to have strategic conceptual ability. Second, you have to be a strong manager because this is an enormous management task to manage relations with 198 countries. Third, you have to be a great listener because the way that you influence people is to develop empathy and argue to their point of view, and you can't get that unless you listen. And finally, because this is the United States of amnesia and America, you need to have the ability to reduce foreign policy to the bumper sticker level. Because that is what Congress critters and much of the public understand. There's a failure of education on several levels. There is no effort made in our schools to teach diplomatic history. You ask anybody, any American, there are a few who will know the answer, but when did the United States become independent? The answer would be at Yorktown. No. 2 years of hard negotiations in Paris to get the Brits to agree to let us go. What was the biggest expansion of the United States? Was it the Mexican War? No, it was the Louisiana Purchase. Who arranged that? Some diplomat. This is not known, not taught, and we are not, as a people, we are very warlike. We have the latest count by, I think the Watson Institute at Brown has a count of how many wars we have been in since our independence. We have gone to war 400 times. So, you know, we're not innocent peaceniks. There's nothing wrong with being for peace if you know how to use it to your advantage. We don't. And I quoted, didn't identify him, but William Tecumseh Sherman, hardly a pacifist. General Sherman devastated Georgia. Is just saying the purpose of war is a better peace. We don't apply that criterion. So that's, I'm afraid we've probably run out of